All right, so the last two conferences are Yalta and Potsdam. Yalta happens in February of 1945, a couple months before Victory in Europe Day. At this point, just like with Moscow, the attention has shifted away from strategy because the Allies are winning, so they don't need to shift their strategy. And it's moved more towards what will happen to the world after the war is over. For this particular one, this happens in Crimea, which is near the city of Yalta in the Soviet Union. Technically, even though this is in the Soviet Union, this conference is led by FDR. So it's called by FDR, but because Stalin is so fearful of flying, he refuses to basically go very far to a conference, and so he makes FDR come all the way out to the Soviet Union, even though the man is about to, die. This is the second meeting of the Big Three. Most of the goal is to talk about the shape of post-war Europe. So it is preceded by the Moscow Conference, where we get the percentages agreement, that unofficial agreement of spheres of influence. Going back to those questions, going back to the spheres of influence for the West versus the Soviet sphere of influence in Europe. At this point in the war, the Soviets are 40 miles away from Berlin. They're very, very close. They've already, in hindsight, we put the word liberated in quotes, but they've liberated Poland, Romania, Bulgaria from German hands. And we know at this point that the German defeat is assured. It's just a matter of time in terms of who's going to get there first and how fast it's going to happen. VE Day is technically at the beginning of May, but the last push really happens in February, so they're months away from ending the war. The conference at this point is thoroughly shifted away from strategy, and we're moving into what exactly will happen. The biggest slight we see during this particular conference, though, is that Charles de Gaulle, who is France's new leader, is not included at these conferences. So even though France has been liberated and they're an ally again, they're not included in these conferences, and that's going to have lasting repercussions with the unity in the West. To be clear, his lack of inclusion is mostly because, number one, FDR does not like him, and number two, Stalin also disagrees that he should be invited. Probably because he's really bitter that he had to fight a one-front war because France fell so quickly. So the idea with Yalta is that it would establish peace terms with collective security and self-determination. So collective security is that goal of the UN. And then also free trade. Self-determination is part of the Atlantic Charter, but it is about what do you do with the liberated people in post-war Europe, because the Nazis conquered a lot of territory, and you've essentially liberated it. What happens? Because their governments are in shambles, a lot of their government leadership was executed. How do you reestablish those countries as stable democracies, essentially, once they have been liberated from the Nazis? We really start to see at this point the three countries, the big three, with differing approaches in terms of what they want. So strategy planning had been pretty uniform, and for the most part there had been a lot of unity in terms of what they wanted, but we're not seeing that in the last two conferences. So for the US part, the United States is looking at this endless war with Japan. The island hopping campaign is going well, but slowly. And so when we're looking at the United States, their focus is not even really on the war in Europe. It's on the war in the Pacific, and with no end in sight, a planned invasion called Operation August Storm, which is bound to take millions of American lives. FDR is looking for aid, and the Soviets are the best people to give that to them because they can shift across their country and just as easily have access to Asia. So he's trying to court Soviet intervention in the war to get help with fighting the Japanese. When we're looking at this particular piece, he has to trade something in order to get this aid. And so FDR essentially becomes willing to trade this unofficial sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, where the Red Army is already at, because they've already liberated Eastern Europe. He has to trade that in exchange for a promise that the Soviets will come and help them defeat the Japanese. He also wanted the USSR to join the UN, because if the USSR doesn't join the UN, it doesn't really have as much scope or as much meaning if it excludes a huge world power. But it's Stalin who essentially pushes for this long-term permanent member Security Council to be given veto power, which we see them use quite a bit throughout the decades that follow. The UK, for their part, specifically is pushing for democratic and free elections in Poland. Please remember that it's the invasion of Poland that actually sparks the war for Europe, or for at least for Britain. That is like the one step too far in appeasement. And so looking specifically at establishing a free Poland is really important to the UK. The USSR, for their part, and this is something that I've referenced before, is really interested in national security, and this goes back to them being demolished in both of the world wars. We talk about there being a Pyrrhic victory in France and in Britain, and while there's not technically a Pyrrhic victory in the Soviet regime, there's a lot of damage. Like a tremendous amount of damage. And they hide it well for decades after the war is over. But they're dealing with a situation where they are very close to devastated. And so they come into this conference with a very different frame of mind, that they want security and some kind of guarantee that this won't happen again. So Poland is one of the key factors in that, because Poland has essentially been the thoroughfare to invading the Soviet Union or Russia. That Germany has twice marched through Poland pretty easily and then tried to conquer parts of Russia. And so Poland is kind of that bulwark that they want to reinforce. And so they promote the idea that they want a strong Polish government in charge, because they don't want to be invaded through Poland once again. The issue, though, is that there are essentially two Polish governments. So there is the Polish government in exile. So when Poland was invaded, a lot of the government leaders fled, and they fled to London because that's their key ally. And so you have the Polish government in exile in London, and then you have this new provisional government set up by the Soviet Union as they came in and liberated Poland. And the USSR is essentially refusing to negotiate with the Polish government in exile. However, they did agree, so Stalin did agree to allow future free elections, and he would allow the former government in exile to run as a democratic party. The only limitations on this are that they can't be Nazi. So when we're looking at other key info, in terms of the Declaration of Poland, so they are allowed to hold a free election. That would include universal suffrage. It would be democratic, and it would be secret ballots. Secret ballots are important. It's what we have here, where you don't have to declare what you're voting publicly. You get to vote in privacy, so that it's more accurate to what you actually want. Any party could run, so long as they were not Nazi. And that the government in exile would be allowed to run for offices as well. This also really started to shift the boundaries of Poland, something that had been discussed in previous conferences, towards the West. In terms of the Soviet entry into the war with Japan, this would happen 2 to 3 months after the surrender with Germany, so it would give them some time to recoup, reorganize, and obviously since most of their troops were in the western part of their country, they would have to shift all of that to the eastern part of their country. That would take time. So it would give them a little bit of time to move their troops over, but in exchange for that, they demanded land claims. So, number one, they wanted land rights returned to them from the Russo-Japanese War, or the Russo-Sinai War, from 1904. So that included part of Japan called Sakulan and an adjacent island called the Kuril Islands. They wanted the commercial port in China and Manchuria called Daren, and then the naval port base of Port Arthur. Those would essentially be dominated, and then there was a railroad that went near those places that they wanted joint ownership of. And this all happens without China even being present at this conference. So the idea is that they would have to get the blessing of Chiang Kai-shek, who is the National Party leader of China at the time, because they're not communist yet. But in order to do that, these claims were all just promised to the USSR before they even asked China their opinion, and they were guaranteed that upon Japanese defeat, those lands would be returned to the Soviets, including lands in China. When we're looking at key significance for this, what we see is that this agreement really kind of violates a lot of the precedents set by the Atlantic Conference. So we're looking at land disputes, territorial shifts, things that essentially would plague the countries that are involved for years to come. It really kind of goes against the notion that there is self-determination when a lot of these land disputes are being settled in conferences by the three largest nations. Plus, there's not a lot of oversight for a lot of the provisions that are set, like the free elections. For the most part, the Soviets actually refuse to allow oversight within their elections, claiming that they have to follow Soviet law. And so the Soviets would take care of that oversight, which is questionable, as we'll see in the next conference. Plus, we see continued land claims by the Soviets. So now not only in the West, but in the East. And that appeasement is going to lead to some very costly future conflicts, essentially. But we are starting to see the Grand Alliance coming apart, mostly because their aims are very different. Alright, Potsdam is the last conference. It's not supposed to be the last conference, but it's the last conference. So this happens in July of it happens in July 17th to August 2nd. This is in between the two victory days. So at this point in history, the war in Europe is over. Germany has been defeated, but Japan has not. For this particular piece, it happens very close to Berlin in a city called Potsdam, so it can technically go by either name, Potsdam Conference or Berlin Conference. It's just as common to see it both ways. For this particular one, what's interesting is that Stalin is still there, but in the middle of the conference, Churchill is voted out of office. Well, not Churchill specifically, but his party is voted out of office, which means that the new prime minister comes into effect, and that's Clement Attlee. So it's both Churchill and Attlee who are at the conference. Truman starts it, Attlee ends it. And then for the United States, FDR has died, so Truman is present. This is still technically a meeting of the Big Three, because the Big Three isn't the people, it's the countries. So it is still a meeting of the Big Three. We have the dates for VE Day and VJ Day, just so you kind of see where we are in comparison. We're a month or so, a couple months out from VE Day and a couple months away from VJ Day. We're kind of right in the middle. And this is the conference that is designed to really solidify what will happen. At this point, or at least since Yalta, the Red Army has essentially occupied the Baltic states, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania. And we see refugees within those areas fleeing out because of what the Red Army is doing as they march through. It's a pretty brutal liberation, especially for people of German heritage, even if they didn't participate in the German army. We're actually going to kind of see that become codified as part of the conference, but there is a lot of movement happening in the eastern part of Europe because of this. Officially, a puppet government has been established in Poland. We'll get to that in a moment. But remember, from Yalta even, there was a provisional government. That provisional government has become more solidified as the government of Poland. Stalin is claiming occupation as a defensive measure, so that goes back to that national security claim that he makes at Yalta. That in order to safeguard the Soviet Union, they need to claim this land in Eastern Europe because it just fell over when Germany invaded it, so they need to stay there to strengthen it, otherwise the Soviets could get invaded again. Plus, he cites that this is a legitimate sphere of influence based on the percentages agreement from Moscow, which was never technically official. And then we already discussed the change in leadership. The agreements at Potsdam are pretty extensive, so this is going to be a couple different slides. Germany is far and away the most extensive because this comes on the heels of Germany's surrender. So what happens in Germany is by far the largest part of this particular conference. But there are several different things that happen that shape the post-war world. Most of it's directed at Europe because that's where the war is over. But there's a little bit that pertains to Japan, just a little bit. For Germany, what they decided is that Germany would be divided into zones of occupation, 4 of them to be specific. So a Soviet zone, a US zone, a UK zone, and a French zone. And that the goal of those occupations was to demilitarize, denazify, democratize, and decentralize the region. So remember, Nazism is fascism. So it's very centralized. So they want to decentralize things. They want an increase in democracy. And most importantly, they want to demilitarize the region. So much so that the core of the German military is completely dismantled along with the entire Nazi party. This included the eradication and nullification of Nazi laws and policies. It included the end of even some of the German police forces that were not technically military because they were so entrenched within the Nazi party. So it's a dismantling of a lot of their institutions that had existed throughout the 1930s and into the 1940s. They agreed that the Nazis would be on trial for their war crimes. Those eventually became known as the Nuremberg trials. And that all Nazi officials, whether they were military or not, would be replaced by pro-democracy officials. Who had moral background checks, essentially, to make sure that they were upright people who didn't believe in Nazi ideology. The German border is officially shifted. This is a discussion that had been happening for a long time, but officially the German border is shifted, reducing its size by about 25% in favor of Poland. And remember, the USSR essentially controls Poland right now. All lands annexed in the pre-war years during appeasement would be returned to their respective countries. That includes places like the Alsace-Lorraine, the Sudetenland, most of Austria. All of that would get essentially returned. For that, essentially speaking of Austria, they also agreed to divide Austria. Furthermore, even though Berlin was in the Soviet zone of occupation, the capital of Germany, Berlin, and the capital of Austria, Vienna, would be further divided into 4 zones. So even though that city is inside of the Soviet zone, the US, France, and the UK have occupation zones inside of Berlin and inside of Vienna as well. When we're looking at the German population, this is where things get really messy and where we're essentially going to pick up in January. But when we look at Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, even parts of Romania, there was an agreement to essentially remove German people from that land in an quote-unquote orderly and humane way. It's in quotes because it doesn't happen that way. The goal is for it to be orderly and humane, but as we will discuss in January, when we look at how this actually plays out, it doesn't happen. The justification for this is that the Germans used Germanic populations in other countries as a justification for essentially expansion, and so therefore we will make it so that there are no German people in other countries. They must all go back to Germany. And so it creates this exodus of Germanic people who now need to move back to a quote-unquote homeland that some of them have never lived in, just because of their cultural heritage. The judicial system and education system were also deemed ill-fit and needed to be denazified. So we see external controls of the judicial system and the education system for a while, just to make sure that Nazi ideology is completely eradicated from those institutions. And then we see the demanding of war reparations from all of the countries, but mostly from the Soviets. There is an agreement that reparations will be taken from their occupied zones respectively. So in other words, the Soviets can't pull reparations from what will become West Germany, because that's not part of their occupied zone. But the Soviets demand up to $10 million in war reparations, which they eventually take from Eastern Germany. In terms of Poland, remember, there is that provisional government that was set up. What the Soviets demanded at Potsdam was that that government, that provisional government, be declared the legitimate government of Poland. They're called the Lublin Poles. Instead of having those free and open elections that they promised they would have, they essentially argue that for the stability of the region and for the safety of both Poland and the Soviet Union, they should just authorize the government that was already in place. And it essentially ousted the Polish government in exile and completely violates what the UK had wanted to do and why they went to war in the first place, to defend Polish sovereignty. So the Poles essentially are now communist all of a sudden. And the Soviets realized that because there are a lot of Polish people in the Western nations, specifically in London or in the UK, that Britain might decide to not send them back. So that they don't have to go back to a communist country. And so they also negotiate that they get a safe return. In exchange for all of this, Polish reparations would be happening, but they would be paid out by the Soviets, who are already pulling reparations from Germany. So Poland itself doesn't actually get reparations. The Soviets do, and then they portion off a chunk of that to go to Poland. This, specifically, what happens to Poland, sets a precedent for what will happen in the rest of Eastern Europe, because the West essentially signs off on it and says, yeah, okay, I guess. And they say okay. The Council of Foreign Ministers is also established. This becomes kind of the forerunner for the permanent members of the UN Security Council. They're tasked with making sure that the end of the war is wrapped up with diplomacy. And so they meet in the future, but it's a kind of coalition of different governments that meet. And then the last major declaration with Potsdam is that they will demand unconditional surrender from Japan, but they do secretly agree that Japan can keep its emperor. So please remember, Japan has an emperor and essentially a prime minister. The prime minister is the one that's very empire hungry. So that part of the government would be taken down, but the emperor of Japan, the eternal emperor, would be allowed to stay because he's essentially a figurehead. The significance of this one is something that, again, we're going to kind of see the aftermath of in January. So in terms of this particular exam and this particular moment, what we need to kind of realize is that this conference really demonstrates that the relationship between the big three is breaking down. There are dramatic differences in their post-war aims. We see the Soviets basically issuing an ultimatum that we had to acknowledge the Lublin Poles as the dominant or legitimate government of Poland. There was a failure to enforce democracy within the Eastern Bloc, and that was established with what happens in Poland. And we're going to see the aftermath of that really carry through in the late 40s and into the 1950s. The United States is continuing to court support for the Soviets in Japan, but while the conference happens, the first successful detonation of an atomic bomb happens, and so it's less important that they get support from the Soviet Union. There's actually a moment in the conference that's recorded where Truman essentially says that they have a new weapon that they have at their disposal, and Stalin is not at all surprised and says, "I hope you use it well." Because it is highly likely that Stalin actually knew more about the development of the atomic bomb than Truman did. Because a lot of stuff was kept from Truman during this time period, and Stalin had an extensive network of spies who were already infiltrated into the Manhattan Project. So we're just starting to see those relationships really fall apart, and a lot of the tension kind of creeping back in between them. The conference itself is not super consequential. It's more so about what fails to happen based on the provisions in that conference. And that's something that really starts to establish the Cold War during the late 1940s.